The crystal chandeliers of the Beverly Wilshire Hotel's grand ballroom cast a warm glow over Los Angeles' elite as they gathered for the 2008 Veterans Support Foundation Gala. Among the sea of black ties and evening gowns, Marcus Chen's smirk stood out like a discordant note in a symphony. At 32, the tech entrepreneur had already amassed a fortune that made most of the room's old money look like pocket change. Another dinosaur event, Marcus whispered to his date, adjusting his custom-made Tom Ford tuxedo. They could have at least gotten someone relevant. His eyes flicked dismissively toward the event program, where Clint Eastwood's name was prominently displayed as the surprise keynote speaker. The muscle in his date Sarah's jaw tightened. A former military journalist, she'd only agreed to attend after Marcus had promised to donate substantially to the cause. These dinosaurs, as you call them, Marcus, they're living history. But Marcus wasn't listening. He was too busy scanning the room, mentally calculating net worths and potential business connections. His company, Chentech Solutions, had revolutionized mobile payment systems, and at this point, he felt more like a favor giver than a favor seeker. The old guard of Hollywood and their charitable causes seemed quaint to him, relics of a bygone era. The ballroom hushed as the evening's host approached the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to have a true American icon with us tonight, a man who needs no introduction. Marcus pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. Sarah elbowed him sharply, but he merely shrugged. Behind them, an elderly man in a perfectly pressed military uniform shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his chest full of medals catching the light. The side door opened, and Clint Eastwood emerged, his tall frame moving with the same purposeful grace that had commanded screens for decades. The room erupted in respectful applause, but Marcus remained seated, scrolling through his emails with exaggerated boredom. Some of you might know me from the movies. Eastwood's distinctive voice carried across the room, a gravelly whisper that somehow commanded more attention than a shout. But tonight, I'm here to talk about real heroes. Marcus snorted softly, earning a sharp look from Sarah and several nearby guests. He didn't notice the way Eastwood's eyes flickered briefly in his direction, didn't catch the subtle tightening of the speaker's jaw. He was too absorbed in his own sense of superiority to recognize the gathering storm. After all, in Marcus's world of disruptive technology and instant gratification, what could a man from Hollywood's golden age possibly teach him about consequence? Little did he know, the next few minutes would shatter his carefully constructed world of digital supremacy and teach him a lesson in respect that no amount of money could buy. Eastwood's voice carried through the ballroom as he began sharing stories of veterans who'd sacrificed everything for their country. The weight of his words hung in the air, touching hearts and bringing quiet tears to many eyes. But from Marcus's corner, another sound cut through the respectful silence, the soft tap-tap-tap of his fingers on his phone screen. When I met Private James Miller, Eastwood continued, his voice dropping lower, more intimate. He'd lost both legs in Afghanistan, but you know what he said to me? The legend paused, his weathered face catching the light. He said, "Sir, I'd do it all again for my brothers." Marcus let out a barely audible scoff, leaning toward Sarah. "Brothers in arms? More like brothers in Hollywood scripts," he whispered, just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Sarah's face flushed deep red, her fingers gripping her champagne glass so tightly her knuckles turned white. The elderly veteran behind them shifted again, his metals clinking softly. His wife placed a gentle hand on his arm, but her eyes burned with quiet anger at Marcus's disrespect. The tension around their table grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Eastwood moved into a story about a young Marine who'd thrown himself on a grenade to save his unit. Marcus's phone buzzed. Another $1 million deal closed. He smiled smugly, tapping out a quick response. "Now that's real heroism," he muttered, referring to his business success, not these ancient war stories. Sarah pushed her chair back slightly, creating distance between herself and Marcus. The soft scrape of wood on carpet drew several glances, including a brief flicker from Eastwood himself. For a split second, the speaker's legendary intensity focused on their corner, noting the disruption but continuing his powerful narrative. These men and women. Eastwood's voice took on an edge that made everyone but Marcus sit up straighter. They understand something about respect that money can't buy. The words hung in the air like a prophecy, but Marcus was too busy showing Sarah his phone screen. "Look at these numbers," he whispered, oblivious to the growing discomfort around him. "This is what matters in the real world." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The veteran behind them cleared his throat, a sound heavy with decades of earned authority. Even Sarah began gathering her clutch, as if preparing for an imminent storm. The waves of disapproval radiating from the surrounding tables were palpable to everyone except Marcus, who remained cocooned in his bubble of self-importance. Eastwood's next words about sacrifice and honor were building to a crescendo, each syllable laden with emotion and truth. The entire ballroom held its breath, completely captivated, except for one corner, where Marcus Chen was about to learn that some lessons come at a price no American Express black card could cover. The moment that shattered the evening's dignity arrived with the precision of a ticking bomb. Eastwood had just begun sharing the story of a young nurse who'd died saving her entire medical unit in Iraq, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd witnessed both Hollywood drama and real-world tragedy enough to know the devastating difference between the two. She was 23. Eastwood's voice cracked slightly, something so rare it made the moment even more powerful. 23, when she threw herself over a wounded soldier as mortar fire. That's when it happened. Marcus Chen's laugh, sharp, loud, and utterly inappropriate, cut through the sacred silence of the ballroom like a knife. He hadn't even been laughing at Eastwood's story. He'd been watching a viral video on his phone, earphone discreetly in one ear. But the timing couldn't have been worse. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that feels like a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. Sarah's face drained of all color as she stared at her date in horror. The elderly veteran behind them stood up slowly, his metals catching the light as his wife gently tugged at his sleeve, trying to ease him back into his seat. Eastwood stopped mid-sentence. For 3 heartbeats, everyone in the room would later swear they counted them. He said nothing. His eyes, those same eyes that had stared down countless adversaries on the silver screen, slowly turned toward Marcus's table. But this wasn't acting. This was something far more genuine, far more terrifying. Marcus, finally sensing the atmosphere, looked up from his phone. The smirk on his face faltered as he met Eastwood's gaze. For the first time that evening, perhaps for the first time in years, uncertainty flickered across his features. The phone in his hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "Something funny, son?" Eastwood's voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the vast ballroom. It wasn't threatening or angry. Somehow, that made it worse. It was the voice of a man who had seen too much real tragedy to let this moment slide. The color drained from Marcus's face as he realized every eye in the room was on him. The weight of hundreds of stares, veterans, their families, Hollywood elite, and most devastatingly, the hard eyes of Clint Eastwood himself, pressed down on him like a physical force. His tech empire, his billions, his arrogant certainty that the digital age had made men like Eastwood irrelevant. None of it could shield him from this moment. Sarah slid her chair further away, the soft scrape echoing in the silence. In that moment, Marcus Chen, the tech wunderkind who thought he owned the world, realized with crystal clarity that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and Clint Eastwood was about to tell him exactly why. Clint Eastwood didn't charge across the room like an angry bull. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Instead, he did something far more devastating. He set the microphone down with deliberate care and stepped away from the podium, his movements measured and precise, never breaking eye contact with Marcus. The sound of Eastwood's footsteps across the ballroom floor seemed to echo like thunderclaps in the deafening silence. Marcus found himself shrinking in his chair, his phone now dark and forgotten in his trembling hand. Each step Eastwood took seemed to strip away another layer of Marcus's carefully constructed facade of superiority. When Eastwood reached Marcus's table, he didn't tower over him or attempt to intimidate. Instead, he pulled out an empty chair and sat down. The action so unexpected it sent a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. His eyes, sharp as steel under the chandelier lights, fixed on Marcus with the kind of intensity that had made him a legend. "You know, son," Eastwood began, his voice pitched low but carrying in the hushed room, "I've met men who've stared down bullets without blinking, men who've carried their buddies through gunfire, women who've saved dozens of lives under impossible conditions." He paused, letting each word sink in. "And in all my years I've never met one of them who thought their sacrifice was a laughing matter." Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came out. Sarah had tears streaming down her face, not of embarrassment now, but of something deeper, recognition of the moment's raw truth. "The nurse in my story," Eastwood continued, his voice taking on a gravelly softness that somehow cut deeper than any shout. "Her name was Jennifer Martinez. Her parents are sitting right over there." He gestured to a couple near the front, the mother clutching a folded flag to her chest. "Would you like to tell them what you found so amusing about their daughter's sacrifice?" The room seemed to close in around Marcus. His world of digital supremacy and financial triumph suddenly felt meaningless in the face of real courage, real sacrifice, real loss. The elderly veteran behind him was now standing at attention, tears rolling down his weathered cheeks. I wasn't, Marcus stuttered, his voice barely a whisper. You weren't what? Eastwood asked, not unkindly but with unwavering intensity. Weren't thinking? Weren't considering that every story I'm telling tonight is about real people, real families, real sacrifice? Marcus's hands were shaking now, his phone slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the table. The sound seemed to echo his falling empire of self-importance. In that moment, facing Clint Eastwood's steady gaze, Marcus Chen, the tech billionaire who thought he was above it all, finally understood the true weight of respect and the devastating cost of having none. The headlines hit before Marcus even made it back to his Bel Air mansion that night. Tech billionaire humbled by Eastwood. Clint Eastwood teaches Silicon Valley a lesson in respect. Marcus Chen's $1 million laugh. His phone, once his constant companion, now buzzed with a different kind of notification. Cancellations, distancing statements, and dropped partnerships. Sarah didn't say a word as she left the gala separately, leaving her silver clutch on the table like a final punctuation mark to their relationship. The next morning, he saw her social media post, a long, heartfelt tribute to her own military family, with a subtle but clear condemnation of those who mock sacrifice. It went viral within hours. The veteran who had stood behind him at the gala, he learned, was Medal of Honor recipient Colonel James Harrison. Images of the colonel's rigid back and glistening eyes during the confrontation became symbolic of the evening, splashed across social media with captions about respect and dignity. Each share felt like another nail in Marcus's reputation coffin. His company's stock took a hit as Respect Eastwood trended worldwide. Investors called emergency meetings. It's not just about the bad PR, Marcus, his board chairman explained during a tense video call. It's about judgment, leadership, values. The words echoed Eastwood's with haunting precision, but it was the email from Jennifer Martinez's parents that finally broke through his defensive walls. It wasn't angry or accusatory. Instead, they attached a photo of their daughter, young, smiling, full of life, standing in front of a medical tent in Iraq. She loved technology, they wrote. She used to say it would help her save more lives. We thought you should know who she was. Marcus sat in his home office, staring at Jennifer's photo for hours. The floor-to-ceiling windows that usually showcased his spectacular LA view now felt like they were displaying his shame to the world. The sleek, modern space that had been featured in countless tech magazines suddenly seemed cold, empty of real meaning. His phone buzzed again. Another partnership dissolution, this time from a veterans technology initiative he'd barely paid attention to when joining. The irony wasn't lost on him. In their polite but firm email, they included a link to a video of Eastwood finishing his speech after the confrontation. Marcus hadn't stayed to hear it, but now he watched as Eastwood returned to the podium and instead of further humiliation, spoke about redemption, about how understanding often comes at a cost, but it's never too late to learn. As night fell over Los Angeles, Marcus Chen, the man who once thought his digital empire made him untouchable, sat alone in the growing darkness. On his desk, Jennifer Martinez smiled eternally from his computer screen, while on his phone, the world continued to react to his spectacular fall from grace. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus Chen turned off all his devices, sat in complete silence, and began to think about what real value meant. A week after the incident, Marcus stood in his grandfather's old study in San Francisco, a room he hadn't visited in years. The musty space was a time capsule, untouched since his grandfather's passing 3 years ago. Heavy curtains filtered the morning light, casting soft shadows on the military medals and photographs that lined the walls, items Marcus had always dismissed as relics of a bygone era. His hands trembled as he opened a dusty photo album. There, in faded color, was his grandfather in Vietnam, young and serious, wearing his medic's uniform. Marcus had never really looked at these photos before, always too busy with his next big tech venture. Now, each image seemed to speak volumes about sacrifice and service that his billions could never measure up to. You tried to tell me, didn't you, Grandpa? He whispered, touching a photo where his grandfather was treating a wounded soldier. The same hands that had later held young Marcus, that had tried to teach him about honor and respect, were captured forever in that moment of selfless service. In the corner, he found his grandfather's old medical bag, the leather cracked with age. Inside was a letter he'd never seen before, addressed to him, dated just before his grandfather's death. As he unfolded it, a small newspaper clipping fell out. A story about Chentech's first billion-dollar valuation. Dear Marcus, the letter began, his grandfather's shaky handwriting filling the page. I've watched you build your empire with pride, but also concern. Success is admirable, but it's what we do with it that defines us. The men I served with had nothing in their pockets but everything in their hearts. Marcus sank into his grandfather's old leather chair, the same chair where he'd once sat as a child, listening to war stories he'd been too young and later too dismissive to truly understand. The chair creaked with the weight of not just his body, but his realizations. On his silent phone, an email waited from Jennifer Martinez's mother. She'd seen his public apology and substantial donation to the Veterans Support Foundation. Money is appreciated, she'd written, but understanding is priceless. The sun shifted, illuminating a final photo on the wall. His grandfather, in his later years, standing proudly next to a young Marcus at his company's launch. Both were smiling, but now Marcus could see what he'd missed before. His grandfather's gentle concern behind his proud smile, perhaps already seeing the path his grandson was taking. I get it now, Marcus whispered to the empty room, to his grandfather's memory, to Jennifer Martinez's spirit, to Clint Eastwood's words that had cracked open his carefully constructed world. His voice cracked as years of ignored wisdom finally found fertile ground in his heart. Standing up, Marcus walked to the window and drew back the curtains, letting full sunlight flood the room. The metals on the wall gleamed, no longer relics but beacons, showing him a path forward that had nothing to do with market valuations and everything to do with real value. 6 months after the gala, Marcus stood in the entrance of the Veterans Medical Technology Center, a state-of-the-art facility that now bore his grandfather's name. The building wasn't a monument to his wealth, but rather a bridge between his world of technology and the values he'd finally come to understand. Inside, veterans were learning to use cutting-edge prosthetics, rehabilitating with advanced therapy systems, and training for tech industry jobs. Each piece of technology had been carefully chosen not for its profit potential, but for its ability to serve. Marcus had personally overseen every detail, working alongside veteran advisors, including Colonel Harrison, the same man who had stood behind him that fateful night. As he walked through the facility's main hall, a familiar gravelly voice stopped him in his tracks. Quite a change from watching viral videos at formal events, isn't it? Marcus turned to find Clint Eastwood standing there, looking exactly as he had 6 months ago, but this time with a subtle hint of approval in his eyes. The legendary actor had come to tour the facility, though no press was present. This wasn't about publicity. "Mr. Eastwood," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying the weight of half a year's worth of understanding. "I didn't expect. Most important lessons in life come unexpectedly, son," Eastwood interrupted, his eyes scanning the facility. They paused on a young woman learning to use a new prosthetic arm, her determined smile reminiscent of Jennifer Martinez's photo. Together, they walked through the center, watching as technology and humanity merged in ways Marcus had never considered before. In one room, his company's latest neural interface was helping a veteran communicate again. In another, virtual reality systems were treating PTSD. "You know," Eastwood said, stopping at a wall displaying both military medals and technology patents side by side, "it's not about choosing between the old and the new. It's about understanding what really matters, regardless of the era." Marcus nodded, touching his grandfather's medical bag, which now sat in a display case alongside the facility's mission statement. "I needed that laugh to be silenced," he admitted, "so I could finally hear what my grandfather had been trying to tell me all along." As they reached the exit, Eastwood turned to him one last time. There was no need for grand speeches or dramatic moments. Instead, he simply extended his hand, a gesture of respect between equals, between men who understood the value of both progress and tradition. Outside, the California sun was setting, casting long shadows across the facility's grounds where veterans and tech experts worked together, bridging worlds that Marcus had once thought were incompatible. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably another update from the center's operations. But for the first time in his life, Marcus Chen let it wait. Some messages, he had learned, were better heard in silence, and some wealth couldn't be measured in stock prices or market caps. As Eastwood's car pulled away, Marcus stood watching the facility his humiliation had built, knowing that sometimes, the most powerful response to a mistake isn't a defense but a transformation.